you so much, Celeste, and thank you, Stephanie and Odlin, for hosting today. I think this is a timely conversation and an unfortunate one that we have to be having in 2023 at a time where I would rather be hanging out with my trans siblings and friends and living good, happy lives rather than wrangling with an unprecedented surge in anti-2S LGBTQI+ hate. So I'll start a little bit by introducing myself. My name is Fae Johnstone. I use she and they pronouns. I'm the executive director of Wisdom to Action. We are a small but feisty consulting firm and social enterprise that works on queer and trans issues, on gender justice, on community engagement, and nonprofit organizational development. So things like strat planning, needs assessments, and all that kind of good stuff. As part of our work, we leverage our profits, our resources, and our platform to advocate on queer and trans issues across Canada, largely focused on the federal government, but also commenting on emerging queer and trans issues and helping rally allies, champions, and supporters to push back against hate and misinformation. I'm also the mom to the two cutest ferrets you could ever meet, and the one cutest cat in this world who likes to meow very loudly. So if you hear a meow, it is not a human being, it's my cat wanting to get into the space. And I've been doing 2SLGBTQI+ advocacy in Canada for about 10 years now, since I was a wee little 17-year-old who was angry and unhappy at my experiences in high school. And again, just imagining the world should be safer than it is today. The focus of our conversation today is on how we can fight transphobic online hate. My hope for the structure is to give a bit of an introduction to rising hate, just to help make sure that we're all on the same page, to talk about some examples of that hate, and then to shift towards what we can do as trans folks, as allies, as organizations, to support and protect ourselves and our people, but then more broadly to challenge this rise in hate and to recognize the role of governments, of allies, of communities in pushing back against rising misinformation and vitriol that will have a horrible impact on the well-being of trans and gender diverse communities if times don't change. I always like to start off by recognizing that I live and work on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, colonially known as Ottawa, and my firm, Wisdom to Action, is based in Chipuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, colonially known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. A land acknowledgement is always an important part of a process and a practice, but often falls short of challenging us in the right ways to address colonialism and white supremacy in our work. And so I'd like to start by just emphasizing that the rising hate we're witnessing right now targeting trans and gender diverse communities is not an anomaly. It is one of many expressions of colonialism and white supremacy and is but the latest iteration thereof. Homophobia, transphobia are expressions of Western gender norms and gender structures that were brought and violently imposed on the First Nations and First Peoples all across Turtle Island, or what we now sometimes call Canada and the United States of America. And so I think it's important that we contextualize rising anti-trans hate amidst other efforts such as residential school denialism, such as rising white supremacist and far-right organizing all across this country and all across the world. We are seeing efforts to roll back anti-racism initiatives in our schools and in our public institutions. And that is not a coincidence. They have come for trans people, but they are equally coming for Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities, and efforts and initiatives to support the rights, the health, the well-being of BIPOC folks, of trans folks, and most integrally of folks who live at the intersection as Black, Indigenous, and racialized trans women and trans people. And so I really just wanted to start off there because I often worry that we silo anti-trans hate as its own separate thing, and that we have to recognize that that does a disservice to anti-racism advocates, Black, Indigenous, and racialized human rights champions and human rights defenders, because this hate is not an anomaly. This hate is part of a broader social structure that is very much trying to hold on to racist, sexist gender norms, to racist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic ways of working. Now, what are we seeing? What is this supposed factual rise in hate targeting 2SLQI plus people? It is definitely rearing its head online in a very significant way, but a lot of it is translating into in-person hate as well. In the past few years, we've seen a staggering rise in police-reported hate-motivated violence targeting 2SLQI plus communities. There was a 64% increase from 2020 to 2021. And that is not something we can emphasize enough. That demonstrates that the very real safety and well-being of trans, gender diverse, and 2SLQI plus community members is being put in jeopardy, and that online hate, this social vitriol that we're seeing, is in fact directly impacting the health, the well-being, and the safety of queer and trans communities all across this land. When I was at a conference in Kelowna recently with pride organizations from across the country, and they are absolutely terrified at the unprecedented security concerns that they're facing with their events. We are seeing our drag events being targeted. We're seeing queer and trans organizations mobbed with tsunami after tsunami of hate in their mentions. I think, and my heart goes out to the folks in North Bay and Outland Pride, if I'm getting their name right. Please, apologies if I got it wrong. And so this is happening all across the country. And it is absolutely fueled, if not driven by, the proliferation of anti-trans rhetoric in our social and social media spheres. What we're seeing on Twitter in particular, but across other platforms as well, is the increasing association of trans and gender diverse people with one, groomer and pedophile rhetoric, the equation of trans and gender diverse people with pedophilia, something that is categorically untrue, and which is a revival of one of the most dangerous anti-gay tropes that we witnessed targeted at gay men and trans people in the 1970s. And so that is one category of misinformation and hate we're seeing, the equation of trans and gender diverse people with grooming and with pedophilia. Two, we are seeing increasing efforts to frame trans people and trans women in particular as threats to women, as threats to children, as threats to the rights of women. Again, these groups will levy all of their rhetoric, even when we know it's categorically untrue. We know that trans rights are not a threat to women's rights, and feminist organizations all across Canada have loudly and proudly affirmed their commitment to trans inclusion and disavowed anti-trans groups that call themselves feminists. We are seeing increasing efforts to restrict gender-affirming healthcare using isolated examples of care that didn't go the way that somebody wanted it to, or isolated examples of care taking place or being provided to folks who are under the age of 18. My general stance on all of this is that it is not our job to regulate what a doctor, what conversations a doctor has with a child or a young person, and that those decisions are best held and best permitted to take place between a provider and the client or patient that they're serving. What's worrying right now is that all of this online hate is perpetuating the demonization and dehumanization of trans people, and again, trans women in particular. As folks may know, at the start of March, on March 1st, I was going to say this month, but it's a whole new month and a whole new fiscal year. At the start of this month, I was included in a Hershey's Canada ad campaign, HeforShe, which was a celebration of International Women's Day. And I think my experience illuminates or illustrates the degree of vitriol we're seeing around the world right now when it comes to trans people. I was one of 5 young women included in this campaign. I had the honor of having a 15-second ad spot telling a bit of my story, and my face was indeed on a Hershey's cookies and cream chocolate bar that you can still pick up at your local convenience store. Within an hour of me going live on Twitter with this ad, I was stomped on by leaders of the far right across North America. That includes Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, Matthew Knowles, Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh, and a long list of others. Overnight, I had my social media mobbed with a tsunami of hate. with slurs all over my mentions. I had threats and encouragements to self-harm in my Twitter, in my personal work and work inboxes. I had private photos of me, including pre and early transition pictures, shared widely, and multiple memes made with caricatures of my face. I also had my dead name publicly released by Matt Walsh on a video seen by over 100,000, I think 150,000 people at this stage. That same, what happened to me was a crisis that put me into all sorts of unpleasant spaces. I cried on my spouse's shoulder more often than I normally would. And in this work, it's not an uncommon experience for the hate to be too much, and we all need an outlet. But mine is just one of many examples. A dear friend of mine, Kat Haynes, who works at Justice Trans, one of Canada's only trans organizations, who are doing phenomenal work on access to justice and understanding justice concerns within trans communities. Kat Haynes was demonized by an anti-trans publication because she had the gall to run a trans youth mentorship program in Saskatchewan. She had her artwork used against her. She had her thesis used against her. She had information about herself and her family members, her personal life, shared with in this article and by anti-trans groups across Canada. That same month, a friend of mine, Marnie Panas, who lives in Calgary, was demonized and targeted for speaking at an International Women's Day event as part of a panel. And so we are seeing an increasing loathing of dehumanization of trans and gender diverse people all across the country. And yes, this is, influenced in a significant way by far-right extremism in the US. We are recognizing that there are, in fact, a lot of Canadians who watch Fox News and who listen to Tucker Carlson. But I also think we are having our eyes opened to the existing far-right extremism that lives and thrives here at home. We are seeing, examples such as Jordan Peterson, a made in Canada hate monger, becoming famous around the world. We're seeing examples such as the founder of the Proud Boys being a Canadian. And so I think, again, we do a disservice to intersectionality if we don't recognize how many of these forms of hate are directly connected to far-right and white supremacist organizing. I live in Ottawa. We had the convoy occupation shut down our city. And it was not a coincidence that we also had anti-trans groups in that convoy doing spin for the white supremacists attending that convoy as well. And so rising hate is proliferating our social spheres, our social media. And aside from the impact that has on trans people, that has a significant impact on the individuals targeted. Myself, Celeste, who introduced me, has also been subjected to this hate, and other trans women and trans folks. We pay a price for our visibility and for being advocates who are sharing our stories and speaking our truths. But the thing that really scares me about this hate is not necessarily what's happened to me. I will take the punches. I'm used to it at this point. It's been 4 times in 6 months that the far right in Canada has come for me. The worry is the ripple effect that stomping on us creates. Because when they come for us, it's not just about coming for us. It's about sending a message to everyone else to not be like us. It's sending a message that this is what happens if you dare to speak out as a trans person in social media or in media writ large. And so the chilling effect of this hate is that for the first time in my career, I am hearing from trans people who are declining to participate in media or in public events due to a risk of backlash and hate. And so there is a significant impact on our ability as a community to exist in public life when the cost, the opportunity cost of doing so, the price we pay in doing so, is ever increasing. My worry in Canada right now is that we have a window of opportunity. Online hate is growing, in-person hate is also growing. And we only have so long before it gets worse here, as it has gotten worse in the US, the UK, and other countries around the world. My worry is that Canada will allow our belief in ourselves as a quote unquote multicultural country that believes in equity, diversity, and inclusion to act as a smokescreen, even as the hard-won rights, the hard-won public acceptance of trans, gender diverse, and 2SL2I+ communities is rolled back because of shifting social environments. And so my biggest message to y'all today is that we need everyone to act now before it gets worse here too. I am terrified that the breathing room we created for the next generation of queer and trans young people, these kids who had the opportunity to grow up and learn about themselves, their community, and their identities in schools, I am worried that that space is shrinking and that they are not being given the space and opportunity to be their honest and authentic selves. And that is something that we fought and that members of our communities bled to give this generation, and it is at risk. Now, in terms of what we do about this crisis more generally, for individuals, for trans and gender diverse folks, for anyone speaking out publicly, I would say first and foremost, prepare yourself for the blowback and the hate. If you get on their radar, they will come for you, but you will be supported by community, by organizations and allies, and we will back you up every step of the way. But we do need to be prepared to witness and experience that hate, and it does take a toll. Second, we should review publicly available information about ourselves because they will drag up everything and anything they can to paint us in a bad light. I had tweets that I had sent to my spouse in a joking kind of way used to allege that I'm violent and a bad person. And so we should review publicly available email addresses, photos of ourselves from pre and early transition days, in any information about our dead names or photos of our houses or living spaces. That is not to say we should get rid of all of it, but to be able to go into these opportunities informed about the risk and aware of what vulnerabilities we might have or what elements these folks might be able to take and wield against us in a bad way. I would also say you definitely need to develop a crisis plan and to have a conversation with your spouse or loved ones about at which point they're allowed to take your phone and throw it against the wall and tell you to get the hell off of social media. That is a thing I am horrible at because I live on Twitter, but it is a healthy practice nonetheless because it is going to hurt to have to see all of this hate. For organizations, I suggest tracking every instance of hate that you receive, because we never know what might escalate and we need a record of what's happened. We should also be developing plans for supporting trans and gender diverse or queer staff targeted by hate. When we got mobbed, it wasn't just me, it was my organization and our social media channels. So we connected with all of our team to make sure that they felt supported, that they had access to resources, and that they weren't vulnerable in being targeted also or after. We also need to respond, and we need to respond in alignment with our values and our principles. I think in 2023, saying trans women are women and trans men are men is not going to cut it anymore. These groups are leveraging heinous misinformation against us, and we should not be, echoing their rhetoric. We don't need to mention the word groomer in our response to allegations that queer and trans people are groomers. But we do need to actually counter that misinformation by categorically affirming that trans people are not a threat to children and young people or to women. We need to categorically affirm that trans people have been on the front lines in the fight against rape culture and against patriarchy since before there was a word trans to describe our communities. We also need to uplift, celebrate, and amplify trans people. Now more than ever, even recognizing the vulnerability and risk of that visibility, we need trans folks to be in the public eye and supported to do so in the safest and healthiest ways. We need organizations to loudly and proudly share their commitment to trans and gender diverse rights and to take relevant stances as applicable to their mission and mandate to share where they fall in the fight for trans rights and trans justice. What I mean by that is that healthcare organizations need to categorically condemn misinformation seeking to target access to gender-affirming care. Feminist and women's organizations need to respond to far-right groups claiming to be in the fight to defend and help women whom they never cared about before. But feminist and women's organizations need to be ready to debunk that misinformation. When they say that privacy protections for trans and gender diverse youth in our schools is the equivalent of transing children, we need children's rights advocates to speak up loudly and denounce that rhetoric. Right now, it is largely a small set of unpaid, underpaid, under-resourced trans and gender diverse folks, largely trans ladies, women, gals, and femmes, who are fighting this fight. And despite what the far right likes to tell you about us, we are a community that is more likely to be poor, more likely to have housing instability, and more likely to be cast aside by everyone else the moment we say something not everyone agrees with. And so now is an opportunity for folks to be resourcing trans and gender diverse advocates and recognizing that by doing that, you are actually advancing your mission. Efforts to attack trans and gender diverse people are a warning sign of efforts to restrict access to abortion, sexual and reproductive health and rights. There are efforts to restrict and remove privacy protections for all members of our communities and to re-entrench gender norms that were dated in the 1950s and misogynistic as hell. And so we need folks to not just think of trans issues and trans communities as like a statement you put out at Pride or something that you put up for Trans Day of Visibility, because while it is important to have that positive messaging, we need you to meet us in the middle and to bring your resources and your expertise. There is literally one national trans organization. It's Justice Trans. They've been around for like 3 years. They've been around for a hot second. We don't have lawyers with expertise. We don't have comms people or policy advisors. And so we need others to come along with us, and it can't just be us operating in this silo. We also need to mobilize and pressure governments to act on 2S LGBTQI+ and trans issues. A rise in hate is not an accident. A rise in hate happens in part because we still haven't done the work to dismantle homophobia and transphobia in our communities. That is exactly what far-right extremist groups are tapping into right now. They're leveraging residual or latent homophobia and transphobia, and they've recognized they can actually use us as a wedge to restrict and roll back the rights of our communities and of others. The federal government has done a lot of good work on 2S LGBTQ issues in the last few years, but I worry that they are not recognizing that this is a whole new ballgame, and that the situation that we're in with far-right anti-trans extremism is not one to be taken lightly. Provincial and territorial governments can implement stronger education in classrooms and schools across this country because most trans and gay kids are still experiencing homophobia and transphobia in the classroom. We need to challenge our institutions to act now. I emphasize that again and again because I am not able to do this alone. Celeste is not able to do this alone. The many of y'all who I know are our champions and who are also doing this work in the audience, y'all can't do this alone either. We need a whole of government and a whole of society approach if we're going to do justice to trans and gender diverse people. Right now, I feel absolutely exhausted and traumatized by the month that I've had. Again, I don't want to overemphasize that I'm not looking for a pity party, but imagine having personal information about yourself shared on a video viewed by hundreds of thousands of people. Imagine knowing that every time you go and speak at an event, you're going to have to worry that somebody will disrupt that event. And you're going to have to worry that it won't just be somebody with a well-intended question, but that it will be a fascist or a far-right organizer disrupting your space. I have to watch everything that I say in public now out of the risk that it will once again land me on Tucker Carlson's Fox News show. This is the world that trans people now walk in, and we need folks to wake up to it. It has never been as scary for trans and gender diverse communities as it is right now. And if we want that next generation of trans kids to do better, if we want them to thrive in every way that they should, we need to come to bat in a big way. I don't want to be here in 2023. I have other issues I'd love to be talking about. Trans people are 1% of the damn population. They're 1% of the population. I believe firmly in the need for gender justice to address misogyny and patriarchy and the gender-based violence pandemic happening across this country. We have crises in our underfunded women's shelters. We have crises in a gendered homeless crisis and a gendered housing crisis. Trans people are not asking for much, but right now in this moment, we are the tipping point. We are the tip of the spear of a much broader far-right extremist movement. And if they come for us, they will come for others next. We should not be having another year where trans kids are waking up to headlines where their rights are under debate. We should not have another year where trans people have to be scared that their access to healthcare will be delayed or stalled or shut down entirely. We are not at the point in Canada that we have seen in the US and the UK, and that is something to be happy about. But if we don't do anything, it's going to get that bad here soon. If we don't do anything, it will get worse than it already is. And let's be real, most trans and gender diverse folks already are having a hard time. 48% of us make under 30K a year. 84% avoid public spaces due to fears of harassment and hate. Trans people are more likely to be harassed, to be catcalled, to be subjected to hate-motivated violence online and in real life. My fear is that in 3 years, we're going to have socio-demographic data that says that the progress of our community in terms of economic, health, and social acceptance has actually rolled back. And so as I come to a close, my message now is thank you for all that you are doing. If you showed up here, you clearly care, but please lean in and bring trans and gender diverse people with you, because we need to be in the room and we need to be resourced to fight this fight at the degree that the far right is. And they are outfunding us, they're out resourcing us, they're out staffing us, and we will lose if we don't push back in a strategic and categorical kind of way. With that, I think we'll open it up to questions, and I hope I didn't ramble on for too long.